In this video, I want to talk a little bit about an introduction to photosynthesis. Sometimes we think about photosynthesis being sort of the reverse of cellular respiration. It's not exactly the case, but as far as writing the equation, it's sort of backwards. So what we're going to do, this is the general scheme of photosynthesis. We're going to take carbon dioxide and water, turn it into oxygen and glucose. More specifically, we're turning this water into this oxygen, and that would be an oxidation reaction, right? We're losing those hydrogens from water and we're making more bonds to oxygen. And more specifically, this is part of the light reaction, which we'll get into in just a second, of photosynthesis. The other portion, we're taking these carbons and we're fixing them, or these carbon dioxide, and fixing them into glucose. And that, of course, we're adding these hydrogens here. We're adding hydrogens to this carbon dioxide, turning it over here. So this is going to be a reduction reaction. And this is actually going to be part of the dark reaction of photosynthesis, which brings me to this idea of these two processes. So the two processes of photosynthesis are the light reaction, or the light dependent reaction, and the dark reaction, which is the light independent reaction. So as you may have guessed, the light reaction actually requires light. It's light dependent, okay? And the dark reaction does not require light. It's light independent, but you'll see that there's a small subtlety that's important there. Let me start off with talking about the light reaction. The light reaction's purpose or function is to use light energy from light, which makes sense, right? It's the light dependent reaction. It uses light energy to power the production of two different things. Those two different things are NADPH and ATP. So it uses light energy to power the production of these two molecules. Where does this happen? In prokaryotes, it occurs along the plasma membrane, which is not really too important for our discussion, so I'm just going to skip over that. But in plants, it occurs in the chloroplasts. Okay, but where in the chloroplasts? Okay, more specifically, the thylakoid discs, and even more specifically, along the thylakoid membrane. And shortly, I'll be talking about the anatomy of a chloroplast, so that this portion here makes a little bit more sense. So what is the light reaction really? It's a series of redox reactions. It's a series of redox reactions that starts off by taking water and turning it into oxygen, right? And that, of course, as we just mentioned, right, was an oxidation reaction, okay? And would this be a favorable or unfavorable process if we're taking water and turning it into oxygen? I don't know about you, but every time I see a glass of water, it does not turn into oxygen. So this process is extremely unfavorable, okay? Extremely unfavorable. Okay, so it requires energy, right? Where does that energy come from? Well, from light, right? The energy from light drives the light reactions of photosynthesis. So, of course, the redox reactions begin with turning water into oxygen, and it ends with taking NADP plus and reducing it to NADPH. So this first process kind of makes these NADPHs, and along the way we establish a proton gradient, which we'll talk about in more detail later, which powers the production of ATP. Okay, and this here is called photophosphorylation, which is a little bit different than what we talked about with the electron transport chain, which was oxidative phosphorylation. The reason why this is called photophosphorylation is because the entire process essentially is driven by energy from light, and photo means light. There are two photosystems that are involved with the light reaction, and they are photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. And you'll notice I wrote photosystem 2 before photosystem 1. It's kind of weird. Why would I do that? The reason I wrote photosystem 2 before photosystem 1 is that the order in which they occur is 2 and then 1. So photosystem 2 comes before photosystem 1. Okay, and we'll see the details behind that later. So what goes on in the dark reaction, right, or the light independent reaction? The purpose of the dark reaction is to use ATP and NADPH from the light reaction to make glucose. Which is of course C6H12O6. Okay. So for prokaryotes where this occurs, the only place that it can occur, because prokaryotes don't have organelles, cellular organelles, it would occur in the cytosol. Again, that's not really too important for us. We're more concerned with plants. At least I am. So in plants, they occur in the chloroplasts, but where in the chloroplast specifically? They occur in the stroma. Okay, so let me actually underline the thylakoid membrane over here for the light reaction and underline stroma. That's the most important part. The dark reaction, as you may have already known, is called the Calvin cycle, and it's named for, of course, the person who discovered it, which was Melvin Calvin. The steps of the dark reaction are called carbon fixation steps. You're fixing carbon dioxide, right? They're also called the carbon assimilation steps. And basically, we're taking carbon dioxide and reducing it, right? This is a reductive process to glucose. And I wrote kinda here, and the reason why is because there's of course more detail behind that, and we'll get to that in a future video. Okay, but that's sort of the general overview of what's supposed to happen in the light reaction and the dark reaction. Now, I do need to talk about the anatomy of a chloroplast, just so that you're familiar with it and that everything henceforth makes sense. So, if we think about this chloroplast is in the cytosol of a plant cell. Okay, so now this chloroplast itself has a bunch of different structures that I've labeled with all these white lines here, and I've wrote everything down here in what is this, yellow or goldenrod, if you will. Anyway, it has these 8 different things, okay, that we're going to talk about at least. So A is the outer membrane, and that's this most outer portion here, right? That outer membrane. This is A, the outer membrane. And of course, if that's the outer membrane, this membrane right just inside of it is the inner membrane. Okay. And the space between them is the intermembrane space. Now, I breezed through that really quickly because I don't really care about those locations. Okay, they're not all too important for understanding photosynthesis. There are portions that are much more important. Okay, so inside of the chloroplast, the space here, that's this whole space here, is called the stroma. Okay, and that, oops, I didn't want to write it all out. I tried to save myself some time. The stroma is labeled C. That's just the space bound by the inner membrane of the chloroplast. So this entire space here is the stroma, and that's actually going to be pretty important for us to think about. Okay, especially since that's where the Calvin cycle occurs. It's also involved to some degree in the light reaction, which we'll see later. So in the chloroplast, there are these little discs, okay, and they're in stacks. So these discs, of course, are the thylakoid discs. So this here is pointing to actually one disc, so that's going to be a thylakoid disc, which is labeled by F. Now, these thylakoids, or these thylakoid discs, are, they have their own membranes, okay, which I've labeled with this line here. So that's, of course, the thylakoid membrane. Anything inside of the thylakoid is considered the thylakoid space or the thylakoid lumen, which I've noted here. Okay, and that, of course, all of these locations, the thylakoid space, the stroma, and the thylakoid membrane, are going to be very important to consider when we're talking about the reactions of photosynthesis. Now, when we have a stack of discs, that's basically just called a granum, and if there's multiple granum, they're grana. So that's what I've labeled here with E. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind when we're talking about the reactions of photosynthesis. Hope that was helpful. Thanks for watching.